Now, I was late to playing Breath of the Wild. 6 years late, in fact, but after finishing this game I was puzzled. At this time, two things strayed into my mind. The first being, damn, this game is good. While the second was a question, what makes this game so good? And I can answer that question. An answer so obvious and plain to see, I think it's been looked over. Breath of the Wild does not try and push the boundaries of what is modern fantasy. In fact, it's not modern fantasy at all. It is very much classic fantasy. While authors, game and movie directors, and all the other spawn of modern fantasy are trying to innovate and be different, Breath of the Wild comes in with the basics, the bread and butter. It doesn't try too hard or innovate on a trope level. And because of this, it is such a breath of fresh air in the dusty closet that is the current state of fantasy. In medias res, a Latin phrase meaning in the midst of things. Modern fantasy has been plagued by this storytelling technique, thrusting us into the midst of an ongoing story or conflict without providing extensive expositional backstory. The main influences on this narrative approach are likely films. As a more passive medium of entertainment, there's a need to draw a viewer in from the start, unlike with literature, which has a layer of interaction, that being reading. Video games fall somewhere in the middle of the two, or perhaps more on the literature side of things. But alas, so too have video games been plagued by this trend. Consider some other games: Skyrim, Halo, God of War, Subnautica, or fantasy books like The Blade itself, Tombs of Atuan, The Lies of Locke Lamora, The Name of the Wind. In all these we start in medias res, thrown into the deep end as things happen at a fast pace. The tempo set at the start of Breath of the Wild is slow. We wake up knowing nothing, as the world is built up around us. We are introduced to the game mechanics and lore as we play. The story moves slowly, and throughout this initial stage, as we piece together the events that led to Hyrule's demise through fragmented recollections. And looming ever in the background is Hyrule Castle, like a sword of Damocles hovering over our heads as we play. Going from divine beast to divine beast, it lingers there, just over the horizon. The game's pacing and vast scope are unique in video game storytelling. The primary quest and stories can be interacted with whenever and however the player chooses. We are free to strike our own course, learning things for ourselves through discovery. Haunting over modern fantasy is the Shadow of Tolkien, and his shadow is long. Tolkien is regarded as the grandfather of fantasy. He wrote The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and the lore of his world, the Silmarillion, and other pieces he is less known for. Now I bring this up for the simple fact that Tolkien has influenced a large amount of the tropes we see in fantasy today. And what we've seen recently are authors, and I say authors as this can best be illustrated in literature, trying to escape from that shadow. Here is Patrick Rothfuss, author of The Name of the Wind, talking on why fantasy books contain maps.
That's okay. But then I'm like, why should I feel obliged to have a map in my fantasy book? And the answer is usually, well, you just kind of do with secondary world fantasy. And then you go, well, why is that? Well, because everyone does. Well, why does everyone? Well, Tolkien did.
Now you may say, well, surely Japan couldn't have been influenced by Tolkien to the degree Western fantasy has. But in fact it has. Tolkien's books have consistently been popular in Japan, with high sales figures over the years. His novels have been published in multiple editions and have been widely available in Japanese bookstores and libraries, indicating a sustained interest in readership. And then there's the pop cultural influences. Elements such as elves, dwarves, and mythical creatures that resemble Tolkien's races frequently weaseled their way into Japanese video games, manga, and anime. And yes, while Tolkien took most of his ideas from the Finnish epic, the Kalevala, and Norse mythology, like the dwarves and elves, he popularized them. Now, I go on about all this, as Breath of the Wild and Zelda as a whole embraces this aspect of fantasy, the aspect which Tolkien pioneered, unscared and proud of its roots. We're immersed into a world teeming with mythical creatures, whimsical magic, and a sense of grandeur reminiscent of a classic fantasy universe. In Hyrule there are goblin equivalents, dragons, elves, humans, and other fantastical creatures that align with the bestiary themes of Tolkien's work. There is Hyrule Castle on the horizon like the Eye of Sauron, and there is Link's ability to wield the Master Sword as Aragorn wields the Shards of Narsil or Anduril. Above all this is the Sacred Realm. The Sacred Realm in Zelda is depicted as a parallel dimension, a divine realm untouched by evil, and a source of great power. It mirrors Valinor in the Silmarillion, a land reserved for the immortal Valar. Tolkien describes Valinor as a place of unparalleled beauty and purity, blessed by the light of the two trees which bear the Silmarils, jewels of immense power and significance. Just as Valinor serves as the ultimate destination for the elves, the Sacred Realm in Zelda holds a similar allure for its characters. It represents a place where wishes can be granted and where one can find the Triforce. Going back to maps, the map in Breath of the Wild is an essential component of the game's narrative. It serves as more than just a backdrop or straightforward world-building tool. The strategy closely resembles Tolkien's work, where maps play a key role in the story and the overall immersive experience. Breath of the Wild parallels Tolkien's passion for mapping and the significance of geographic detail in fantasy worlds by tying the map into the narrative. Maps are frequently used as a supplemental element in many contemporary fantasy works, either as a visual aid or a technique to improve the sense of scale in the universe, or simply as compensation for what little world building is made in the story. They frequently don't have a direct relationship to the narrative. The map in Breath of the Wild serves as more than just a representation of the game's setting. It becomes a vital tool for players as they travel around and explore Hyrule. The map essentially takes on the role of a character, directing players on their adventure and influencing how they see the landscape. There are various ways to interpret how the map is used into Breath of the Wild's narrative. First of all, the geography reflects the main storyline of the game. The history and lore of Hyrule are progressively revealed as players explore new areas and locations. A sense of mystery is revealed and players are invited to discover the secrets of the land by the markings of ruins, historic sites, and significant points. Maps are similarly significant in Tolkien's writings. Maps of his worlds were meticulously created with every detail in mind. These maps were essential to the telling of the story, rather than just being an instrument for reference. They gave readers a sense of direction and immersion, while also influencing the geography, cultures, and history of Middle-earth. Breath of the Wild clearly shows the impact Tolkien had on the game in regards to maps. In the same way that Tolkien's maps increased the reader's grasp of Middle-earth, Breath of the Wild's map strengthens the player's relationship to the realm of Hyrule. It acts as an interactive visual map that helps players navigate the game's large and varied environments, while also improving the world building. Tolkien and his maps, Breath of the Wild and its maps, these things are congruent. Magic systems, the set of guidelines controlling the use and operation of magic in a work of fantasy. It acts as a framework for describing the operation of magic, its constraints, and the methods by which characters can access and control magical powers. The greatest sin committed by modern fantasy is treating magic as a science. We think it's crucial in modern fantasy to have a great magic system, and this oxymoronic combination of words has been done to death by those like Brandon Sanderson. We need every detail explained to calculate exactly what magic is capable and incapable of doing. Now, wouldn't magic be the opposite of a science? One's a study of reality, while the other is complete unreality. And so Zelda has kept the whimsical spirit of magic, leaving it vague and a thing beyond the player's understanding. There is no system of magic. Magic in Breath of the Wild is a noumenon, the opposite of a phenomenon, which has a cause or explanation in question. It is a thing as it is, in itself and beyond our ability to fully comprehend or understand it directly. There is no arithmetic or science that explains why or how it works, it just does. In Breath of the Wild and Zelda as a whole, magic is kept ambiguous and open to interpretation. While there are specific magical skills, artifacts, and gameplay elements in the games, the fundamental ideas and explanations of magic are not covered in length. The game embraces an air of mystery, which is enhanced by the magic contained within. Instead of giving an explanation on how and why magic operates, the emphasis is primarily on our investigation and discovery. Breath of the Wild leaves magic in the background. It's not consumed by the idea that fantasy and magic are so closely intertwined like a magical bear hug. It doesn't emphasize magic as the main force behind or answer to every issue. Instead, it's more delicately incorporated into the game's universe, enabling other gameplay and narrative elements to take center stage. In fact, the sciencey aspects of the game are often more useful in pushing the story along. The magic in Breath of the Wild is a callback to a pastime, where the Tolkiens, Le Guins, and Lewises dominated the space. before fantasy games and movies when magic was done right. Link is him, the Jungian archetype of the hero, the main character obviously, but that's not always so clear in modern fantasy. There's a tendency of characters with more ordinary beginnings who through pure luck or some incredible aptitude become these all-powerful, invincible Mary Sues, the ones that overcome any problem or enemy that stands in their way. David beating Goliath. In Breath of the Wild, Link's position as the protagonist and the chosen one is obvious. He's intended to protect Hyrule. The game celebrates the traditional cliché of the hero achieving his destiny, in contrast to certain contemporary fantasy storylines that make an effort to undermine or complicate this trope. There's no coincidence or chance involved in Link's character arc. He is not a regular person who just happens to find himself in charge of saving the planet. Instead, this is his fate from the start. Fighting the forces of evil and bringing the land back into balance is his destiny. The game celebrates the classic trope, with Link serving as the symbol of good who will triumph over the forces of evil. The distinction between good and evil goes against the trend of moral ambiguity. It appeals to the traditional part of us that likes simple stories with simple characters. Here we don't have a schizophrenically layered character, we have a two-dimensional protagonist, one that isn't obscured with development and layers intended to confuse the reader and make up for a lack of creativity. Less is sometimes and often more. Breath of the Wild, despite depending on traditional fantasy tropes, ironically stands out as a breath of fresh air in the fantasy genre. From its storytelling techniques to its homage to the classic tropes pioneered by Tolkien, this treatment of magic and its characters make this game a crowning achievement not only for video games, but to the fantasy genre as a whole. The game offers a genuinely immersive and nostalgic experience by going back to the fantasy genre's origins and embracing the features that have captivated people for decades. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the most fundamental aspects of storytelling have the greatest impact on their audiences.
Easy.